lessons that should be drawn from the Kyoto experience?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. I think first and foremost, I would say that Kyoto took place in what was fundamentally a domestic policy vacuum. It is critical that what we do internationally be synced up to what we are doing domestically, that there be political support and support here in the Congress for the kinds of actions that we're talking about taking internationally. So that was vividly not true during the Kyoto years. It must be true now, and that again is one of the reasons why the Waxman-Markey legislation is so fundamentally important. Second lesson is that we cannot move forward on an agreement which fails to include the major emitting countries in the world, whether they're developing or developed. The problem is a global problem that can't begin to be solved without the genuine participation of countries like China and the other emerging markets. The reality is that the United States and the developed countries are the big historic emitters. The United States the largest of all, but going forward, the vast majority of the growth in emissions is coming from the developing world, and they've got to play a significant part.
So how will, in your opinion,
I'm sorry?
How will successful negotiations in Copenhagen help American interests? If you could talk about that in the context of the Waxman-Markey legislation and what the benefits for our people would be.
Well, I think there's a few things to be said. First of all, the climate change threat is a fundamental threat to the United States as well as to other countries, and that's true as a matter of economics, national security, and the environment. All three of those, and not at all least from a perspective of national security, which has been highlighted in recent years. And important report by former admirals and generals that was put out by the CNA Corporation. There was a big front page story in the New York Times just a month or two ago about this, and there's increasing focus within the national security community on this issue. It is also true that as a matter of the capacity to solve the problem, it's a global problem. So that if the United States is a large emitter, but 80% of the problem takes place outside of the United States. So for us to act without action around the world, there's no way to solve the problem. And further, I think it will be in the. I mean, I completely agree with what you said when you said that you referred to a great race in the 21st century with respect to clean energy and the development of clean energy. I think that's got the potential to be the economic driver for all of us, and including the whole world, not just the United States, but places that can be the recipient of United States high-tech exports, is clearly in the interest of this country.
If we could, it would help if you could talk a little bit about the United States-China relationship, the issues of clean energy and climate, and the bilateral negotiations that have been going on in terms of using that as an indicator of the progress that has been made towards an agreement.
Right. Look, the United States and China are the two biggest players here. I mean, if there are two 800-pound gorillas on this issue, it's the U.S. and China represent over 40% of global emissions. So there's no question that we can't get an agreement that is acceptable to us without the genuine participation of China. We have been intensively engaged with the Chinese at various levels, bilaterally in the Major Economies Forum and other places. We have made it quite clear to the Chinese the kinds of things that we need, which I referenced in my testimony. They're going to have to take action, which is commensurate with the scope of the problem, with their role as now the largest emitter. They're going to have to reflect that action in an international context. They're going to have to be prepared to have a strong verification regime and the like. These are all issues that we discuss with them. We are attempting to narrow differences. You know, the part of what is important, I think, with respect to China and other countries as well, but we're focusing on China now, is that this issue has to be seen, and I think that we have actually done a good job in conveying this in a whole array of different situations, starting with Secretary Clinton's trip in February. They have to see that this is a centrally important issue to the U.S.-China bilateral relationship. They care a lot about that. The summit that's going to occur in November between President Hu and President Obama is probably going to be the biggest diplomatic event of the year for China. They do not want this to run off the rails. On the other hand, they are, in all things, tough negotiators and are going to try to get what they see as most in their interest. But I do think China wants to get a deal done. The question is going to be whether we can get the particulars put together in a way that works for them and for us.
My time has expired. We recognize now the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Historically, climate treaties such as the UN, FCCC, and Kyoto have been submitted to the Senate as treaties. A Senate report prior to Kyoto stated that, in the view of the Foreign Relations Committee, any amendment to the convention that adopted emissions target would have to be submitted to the Senate. Will the administration treat a Copenhagen climate deal, if one is reached, as an Article 2 treaty requiring advice and consent by 2/3 of the Senate, or will the administration say that this is a congressional executive agreement that would simply need a majority vote in both houses?
Mr. Sensenbrenner, it's certainly our expectation that an agreement would be submitted to the Senate. I mean, we don't have any other plan at this point.
That's good to hear. Now, the conundrum, of course, is that developing countries, and led by China and India, have adamantly objected to any type of legally binding emissions cap in a treaty. And when you talked in June to the Climate Action Symposium, you started looking at the math of the increasing growth of emissions in China and India, coupled with the targets that are being proposed for the developed world, and you called this the unforgiving math of accumulating emissions. Your words, not mine. In light of this unforgiving math, would you agree to a treaty that did not include binding commitments from developing countries, particularly China and India?
We have, Mr. Chairman, we have in our submission we've called for binding commitments by all the major players, and that's what we're seeking. I mean, it is in our view understandable and appropriate, really, that there be differences as between what the developed countries are doing and what developing countries are doing with respect to the actual content of actions. And I think those are differences that ought to disappear over time. But we still recognize that there's some basis for difference.
Well, the Bali Agreement, which was negotiated by the Bush administration, did talk about differentiated commitments. I guess my question is that if China and India stonewall on the issue of binding commitments, is that a deal breaker that you and the administration would be willing to walk away from?
No, that's what I was just getting to that, Mr. Sensenbrenner. What I was about to say is that I don't think that there's. I see a basis for some difference in content. I don't see a basis for saying we have to stand behind what we're talking about and they don't have to stand behind what they're talking about. So we do think that it is that's quite important, and as I say, it's in our submission.
Well, I can say that looking at it from afar and relying on press reports, the response of the Environment Minister of India following Secretary Clinton's visit to New Delhi and the press conference that she had there certainly was not encouraging that India would sign up for binding commitments. So I wish you good luck in hopefully getting them to realize that they've got to jump on board binding commitments if they expect the rest of the world to do that. The final piece of questions that I'd like to ask you, Mr. Stern, is, as I mentioned in my opening statement, developing countries are trying to weaken intellectual property rights. And I'm very concerned that the developing countries have proposed preventing patenting and developing in their countries, requiring compulsory licensing, ensuring access to new technologies on a non-exclusive royalty-free term. Does the administration support any of these positions, or will the administration work to make sure that the protection of intellectual property rights, which in my opinion is needed to assemble the capital to develop these new technologies, be included in a treaty that comes out of Copenhagen?
We don't support those positions, Mr. Sensenbrenner. Look, I think that intellectual property is central to our system, and indeed, if you look at this problem, which is the way I look at it, I think the way we look at it, is fundamentally an issue that is only going to be solved with the development through innovation, with the development of new technologies, promoted through the right rules of the road, to be sure. You can't have a problem based on whose solution is based on innovation if you interfere with intellectual property rights. Now, having said that, we also have to recognize it is terribly important that we do find ways completely consistent with intellectual property protection where we seek to diffuse and disseminate technology to places that need it. But we don't have any. I don't think I have any difference of opinion with what you've stated.
That's good to hear. I yield back the balance of my time. Quit while we're ahead.
I thank the gentleman. I think it's important to note that you did work on intellectual property issues when you were on the staff of Senator Leahy in the Senate.
Did indeed.
Yeah. Let me turn now and recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think a number of us who had the opportunity to spend a week in China earlier this year come away with the same expression of optimism that you mentioned in terms of the interest in the Chinese. It was, I think, conveyed formally and informally that there was great interest in securing an agreement, that it was clearly important to them, and the notion that there are lots of common interests. And I'd like to return to that in a moment. But before then, I'd like to just follow up on your response to the initial question about what's different now than the Kyoto negotiations you were involved in earlier. You mentioned that we didn't have the domestic policy vacuum, that we have a greater structural framework. I'm pleased that after 8 years of the United States being missing in action, that we've, I think, changed that and that we're working on the policy framework. But I'm wondering if other than the legislation that's passed the House, if you have other thoughts about changes to that framework, like the EPA's decision that we're going to be dealing with carbon pollution as something that is going to be subject to regulation. Are there other elements here that you see that change that framework?
Well, sure. I think that I think the EPA decision is an important one. I think that, again, I see the general domestic backdrop. What's happening here, also with the underpinning in terms of broader understanding and support for the issue in the public, in the national security community, a much greater involvement in the business community, in the high-tech sectors, who I think do see clean energy as the way to go. I mean, I think that people who lay their bets down on high carbon infrastructure, high carbon production methods now are a little bit like the guys who built typewriter plants on the dawn of the PC revolution. It's a bad bet, and so I think that there is a different kind cultural infrastructure, if you will, with respect to where the public is, where the business community is, where the national security community is, and where Congress is. I think all of those things are quite different, and lay the foundation for us to move forward if we can, if we can get this right, and if we can get our international partners to move along with us.
It was interesting, the business community letter to the Senate yesterday, reinforcing your point. Are there provisions in the House legislation that you see specifically making a difference to bring together domestic and foreign interests to be able to understand mutual benefits, so that we're bridging that gap and making it less adversarial, despite perfectly predictable negotiating posturing, but
Right.
elements that we've done here that will help make your task easier?
Yes, I would point to two in particular. I think that, and they're related. I think there are provisions in the bill, one that involves a set aside for international forestry at 5% of allowances, and another that provides a scaling up set aside for adaptation and mitigation, starts at 1% for each, then scales all the way up to 4% for each in the mid-2020s. Those provisions are engines for financial support to poor countries around the world, and in a way that I think is again very much in our interests, and both in our interest from a substantive standpoint and from a diplomatic standpoint of being able to attract support from developing countries. So I mentioned even in my opening remarks, I'm very hopeful that those provisions, or at least some facsimile thereof, can be maintained in whatever the Senate, in whatever version of the bill comes out in the Senate, because I do think those are quite important.
Last but not least, is there anything additional from your vantage point that you think the House and this committee can do in the interim between now and Copenhagen that would be useful?
Well, I think, Congressman, I think that any time members of Congress, whether in this committee or in the House or the Senate, have an opportunity to speak with foreign government visitors on these issues, and to speak to them in a way that imparts some sense of reality to their thinking, that's always good. And and there's different players that can be relevant for. That it's important. I think that the trip that you made to China, I'm sure, was quite important in that regard. There are messages to be sent to places like India, but also to places like Europe. I mean, the thing that is going to allow us to get this done, if we can get it done, is combining a sense of what science requires with a sense of pragmatism. And there's often not enough pragmatism in the international arena. I mean, we can get something done if it's based on what we all need. We can't get something done if it's based on what we all ideally want. There's a difference between what you need and what you want. And if countries can focus on what their real needs are, not on ideology, not on old rhetoric, if they can be sensitive to what is doable in the United States, am proud of what we're doing here. I think the bill that came out of the House was a huge advance, and there are those who say, well, why aren't you doing 5 times as much as that? And it's important to hear messages from members up here saying, this is good, this is solid, this is an important start, this is consistent with what we need to do, and you're not going to do more than that. You're not going to get more than that. So let's get real and let's try to work this out and get it done.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State.
Thank you. When we went to China, we were very impressed with their investments in new clean energy technology, and we were impressed there were things they were doing we didn't know before we went, including their renewable energy standards and the like. It's clear that they're moving. It's clear that they want to dominate some of these industries, and that's one of the reasons I'm happy our stimulus plan got us out of the gate. But I guess the question I have is, as far as an agreement with China, you know, they talk to about themselves as a developing country, which was interesting because we would drive by the main drag going down to the People's Hall past Gucci stores and Lexus dealerships,
Been
and,
there.
you know, and Prada stores, and it was difficult to understand that. And to me, it sort of looked like there was not two parts of the world, the developed world and the developing world. There were three parts: the developed world, the developing world, and China, which is some sort of third tier in its own classification. Should we think of that in these terms and encourage China to think about themselves in those terms? And if so, where do they fit in that tier?
Yeah, I have had very much the same reaction driving down the same road that you did, Congressman. I think China is kind of a developed and a developing country at the same time. It is obviously a huge economic juggernaut. When you see the big cities, they're, you know, gleaming skyscrapers and very modern looking. They still have somewhere between 300 and 400 million people, more people than live in this country, who live on $1 or $2 a day. They're dirt poor in many parts, particularly the rural parts of the country. So they're kind of both. They kind of are a hybrid, as you say. And I think that we have to and are pushing China hard to take strong action. They can't be you can't sort of put China in, expect of China what you would expect of poor countries in Africa or Latin America or Asia. They need to be treated, as do the other emerging market countries, in a way that requires real action, because it's the only way to solve the problem. And over time, and I don't think a very long period of time, I think they're going to need to be treated just exactly the same as developed countries, but we're not quite there yet. I will say that if you look at what China is doing on this issue, it's actually quite impressive. It's not adequate yet, but they're doing a lot. And I have sometimes said that I think the real competitiveness issue for us is that we might think we're going to spend the next 5 years pushing China, and then we're going to spend all the rest of the years chasing them if we don't get our own act together, because they're moving. They see big markets, and they're going to move if we don't.
You know, I think all of our anxiety has been that China is not moving on global climate change. Our economic anxiety should be that they are moving on climate change because they want to dominate these industries. And we ought to be players in this. And
right.
I'm glad the administration and we've worked
look at
with some
electric
success.
vehicles, and look at what they just
Right.
announced on the solar front, which is great. We need that to happen, but we need to be in the game fully ourselves.
Right. I think our bill will help in that regard. We talked to Prime Minister Singh of India a couple of years ago, and he told us, and I don't think he was joking when he said this, he says, you know, India has agreed or will agree to a binding target of CO2 emissions. We will agree never to exceed per capita the average of industrialized nations' emissions. They've sort of said, sure, we'll agree with you. We'll agree never to emit more than you do. We will agree to a binding target. Now, of course, if they get to that level, the planet will be cooked long ago. What do we say to that argument, and what is it in regard to India that we expect?
Well, we say to the argument that obviously that's not good enough. It is the case that if you think about the trajectory of the bill that came out of the House, the per capita emissions of the United States are going to decline very significantly over a period of 40 years or so, if you take this out to 2050. So the disparity...
If we pass our bill.
That's right. If the Senate passes a bill and we get a conference and the President can sign it and we actually enact legislation, which, again, I think there's nothing more important than that. But if that kind of regime gets put in place, you're going to have the gap between the per capita emissions of countries like India and countries like us dramatically decrease because of the efficiencies and the renewable energy development and so forth that will be part and parcel of that legislation. But in terms of what we're looking for from India now, it's very much the same structure as what I said for China. They need to articulate a strong, robust set of actions that are going to reduce their emissions significantly from where they would otherwise be from their business as usual. They've got to reflect those in an international agreement, and exactly what the structure of that is a very live part of the discussions and negotiations. There's got to be a verification system. I mean, it goes under the rubric of MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification, but verification is really the most important piece, so that everybody can see what everybody else is doing and have some level of confidence that, you know, when China or India or France or anybody else says we're going to do X, there's a system to see whether they've actually done X. And then there's got to be a mechanism for financing and technology dissemination. And I think those are the key issues, and we're working with them on all of those issues. And India is difficult. I mean, there's no question about it. India is tough.
Thank you.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Stern, the world is in the throes of the Great Recession, and I think there are some European nations that are already experiencing some relief, and there, of course, is concern that we could pull people back down into a much greater recession if we don't recover. Last year, the UN suggested that $86 billion a year would be needed to provide aid to developing nations as we, began to try to clean up this planet. My concern, and perhaps you've thought about it or maybe even had some discussion about it. At this point, the UN has collected nothing, and given the state of economics around the globe, is there a concern on your part that if we are successful in Copenhagen, but demonstratively cannot provide money? I mean, we have people in the United States who object to paying the UN dues. So when we are asked to provide money for this, and we run into problems at home, does that create cause for China and India to become even more resistant to their participation, since we're not putting any money forth, therefore we must not be serious?
It's a very good question, Congressman, and an important question. Let me say a couple of things about it. First of all, it's going to be important that there be financing assistance at some level provided, particularly to poor countries. It is also true, as Mr. Sensenbrenner said in his remarks, that the kinds of numbers that are tossed around by some in the negotiations are completely wildly unrealistic. I mean, 1% of GDP, things like that, which are untethered to reality. We have to work with the EU, Japan, Australia, other developed countries to develop a overall financing package which is consistent with kind of what we can do. Again, this is an agreement that would kick in starting in 2013. So hopefully we are going to be out of the Great Recession and into a better period of growth by that time. But the amounts of money have to be that are considered and that ultimately get agreed to have to strike a right balance to what's reasonable to provide, and on the one hand, and that's consistent with, or at least gets us in the right direction with respect to the need. On the other side, again, I think that the provisions that are in the Waxman-Markey bill are really quite helpful in that regard, because they do generate some funds, not vast amounts, but a good start through the sale of emission allowances. And so that's, I think, a good way to do it. That's not, doesn't have to get into the yearly appropriations kind of process, but this is a need that's going to scale up over time, and we just have to kind of step in a balanced and reasonable way along with our developed country partners, so that we're making a good start, but it's affordable.
Do you think that it would be important for as of today, we don't even have any administrative cost, which does not bode well for, at least I think, the picture that we need to paint of what is going to happen after Copenhagen. I mean, I think administrative costs have been estimated at about $4 billion, and of course we have nothing on that. I do agree that Markey Waxman does provide some help. The problem, I mean, and maybe you can help us with this, we need a unicameral system of government here in the United States, or either so we can close down the Senate either today or after, sometimes before Christmas. I think that the House has already acted, and we're 3 months away from Copenhagen, so I think it would be important either to close the Senate down or somehow get them to do something they don't like to do, which is vote on legislation. Do you agree with me?
No comment. I'm appearing before the Senate in a week or two, so I worked in the Senate. I'm a big fan of both bodies.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back
I managed to grow up in Chicago and like the White Sox and the Cubs, so I'm not going to get into.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Chair will recognize himself again for additional questions. Inside of the Waxman-Markey bill are individual provisions on renewable electricity standards for our country, energy efficiency standards for our country. How do individual complementary policies like that, included in the legislation, play a role in global agreements on? What role would provisions like that adopted by the United States play in international negotiations on the responsibility of countries around the world to adopt similar provisions?
Well, I think provisions like that are very important for both substantively and actually diplomatically. I mean, substantively because they can push us a good in the direction of taking concrete action to reduce emissions, and as well as improving our overall economic and clean energy profiles. I think those are all they're important for that reason. In addition, Mr. Chairman, there are different kinds of ideas that are being discussed right now with respect to what the structure of this agreement ought to look like. One of the ideas, I think is actually quite an interesting one, has been proposed by Australia, sort of something similar by South Korea, a little bit different, which would contemplate countries entering their commitments or their policies onto a schedule, sort of like in a trade context, and committing to carry them out. So I think that in a structure like that, which again we do find interesting, you could imagine putting in all of our critical policies and what they add up to, and I think that in doing that it gives us the opportunity and I think pushes countries not only to have a number, but to say, not just X%, but here's how we're going to do it. Here's what we're going to do about it. We've got a policy on renewable energy standards and appliances and a cap and trade system, and we're putting our money where our mouth is, and so should you. So I think it's useful in that regard.
Can you talk about the sharing of technical know-how and expertise in emissions verification processes as we're going? How would that work? How do you envision the sharing of the expertise to occur and ensuring that there is, in fact, a verification system in place that would work?
Well, there's two different, there's a couple of different elements to that. There's a measurement and reporting piece of that. The measurement in particular is a piece of that where I think that the technical expertise of countries like the United States will be important in helping various countries, and actually even China, to have greater capacity to measure emissions in a credible way. Verification is, as we see it, fundamentally an issue of trying to establish the countries are actually doing what they've said that they're going to do. And this is a discussion which is live and going on in the negotiations right now. I mean, I think that it will need to a verification system to work is going to have to balance rigor with not being overly intrusive, because countries like us and other countries will have concerns about the degree to which people swoop in from outside. So there's got to be a good balance in how that's done, and we're working on that.
And in your opinion, is it possible to develop a verification regime
Yes.
which can accurately measure emissions reductions without having an overly intrusive system put in
Yeah,
place?
I think that it is, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I think that again, the measurement part is something that we have a lot of expertise in. Other developed countries do, and we can help in what's often referred to as capacity building, so that countries that have less expertise actually can go about effectively measuring emissions. So that's one piece of it. The verification piece also has to do with the degree to which, if country says we're going to do X, Y, and Z, they can demonstrate that they're actually doing it. And I think that there's some of that is going to depend in the first instance on what countries report. There likely need to be some sort of expert review from the outside. I mean, there's a suite of elements that are going to have to be part of that, and I think it will be tricky, but I think it's very important.
It is important, very important. So, for example, if we were looking at the steel sector in China, in the United States, and in India, and we wanted to make sure that that sector was properly verified, would an agreement be reached as part of this ultimate treaty that would put in place a verification system that would be mutually agreed upon by those countries? If you just give us, using
Well, I
that
think
as a specific, using steel as a specific example, could you walk through how that might
Yeah,
unfold?
I think it depends in the first instance on what the actions are that a country agrees to undertake. So let's assume on your hypothetical that China has agreed to do X, Y, Z things with respect to the steel industry. Then I think that it would first of all be important to work with the Chinese to make sure they're capable of measuring the emissions in a reasonably accurate way. And then I think it would be some combination of reporting in the first instance, and this is going to be true for any country, the United States or anybody else. In the first instance, reporting by the country saying, we agreed to do the following things. We're going to have, this, that, or the other kind of policies apply to steel mills, or the building of steel mills, or the running of steel mills in China. Here's what we said we were going to do. Here's what we're doing. And then I think a capacity would be essential to have some kind of outside expert review to be able to look to see what's being represented and determine whether whether it's accurate.
The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Mr. Stern, on June 10th, you were quoted in the China Daily as, quote, "We don't expect China at this stage to take on a national cap." You've been advocating for the national cap in the Waxman-Markey bill. Why is a cap good for us and not good for China?
Well, look, I think it would be great if China took on a national cap. I don't think that's the only way to go. And again, I think that, as I said earlier, China, when talking to Mr. Inslee, China is in a kind of hybrid position. China is obviously a developing juggernaut. It's got a very powerful economy. It's also still, in many respects, developing. So it's somewhere in between. And I think that what we need to get from China is a set of actions that are strong. Now look at what they have, what they're currently doing right now includes a 20% cut in their energy intensity. I think that that is something that's actually economy-wide. It's not a cap in the same way that we're talking about, but it's significant. I think that, and they have they've got a 15% by 2020 renewable energy standard. They've got vehicle standards that are pretty much comparable to ours. They've got a whole suite of other measures for efficiency and the like. It's not, I mean, on the one hand, it's significant and it's doing a fair amount. On the other hand, they're growing so fast that their emissions are still going up a lot. They need to do a set of policies that add up to a national reduction in their emissions, right? That's the thing that we're most fundamentally interested in. If they did a national cap, that would be great. I don't think they're going to do that yet, and I think that I don't think it's crucial for us that happen as long as there's a set of policies that add up to a real reduction compared to.
See, I'm concerned that the Chinese are taking advantage of the differentiated language in the Bali Agreement, basically to cook the math in their favor. The Chinese economy is recovering from the worldwide recession faster than ours. Maybe that's because their stimulus package was more effective than the ones that we have employed. But the projection that I've heard is that the Chinese GDP will go up by about 50% from 2005 to 2010. Now, a 20% cut in energy intensity means that they still emit 30% more in emissions, and that certainly is not going to have the economic impact that the caps in the Waxman-Markey bill are going to impose on the United States. And the Byrd-Hagel resolution basically said the Senate wouldn't ratify a treaty unless it met 2 points. One is that it was worldwide in application, and secondly, that it didn't hurt the United States economy. And if we're reducing our emissions below where we are now, and China is still allowed to increase its emissions by 30%, I just can see more wealth and more jobs being outsourced from the United States to China. And that's not anything that I'm willing to support, and I don't think the American public will support it either. So how do we deal with this issue?
Well, Congressman, I think that what we have to keep our eye on is again the robustness of the Chinese program. And I think in the right circumstances, and we don't know what we've got yet, but in the right circumstances, what you'd like to see is a set of actions that where they are reducing emissions compared to their business as usual path, which is at least in some broad way comparable to or in the range of comparability with what we're talking about. And I think that's possible. Now we don't have that yet. We don't know yet, but that's what we're pushing toward. I mean, again, the reductions that they have been making over this 5-year period, they're not enough, but they're actually fairly significant as compared to where they would otherwise be, and that again is I think what we still need to be focusing on. Now, the other thing, just with respect to our own concerns about our own companies, is that the legislation that was passed out of the House includes a good deal of protection for energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries, basically getting all allowances relating to this legislation free, so that those industries aren't going to pay any more into the 2020s. Aren't going to pay any more. So it's not a case that you've got this trade-exposed industry and they're going to pay so much because of this bill, and the Chinese aren't. They're not going to pay.
But, you know, with all due respect, Mr. Stern, you know, boiling the math down to the bottom line, meaning when you push the equals button on the calculator, what the Chinese say they're doing is they're cutting back on the growth rate of their emissions so that they'll still be 30% above 2005 levels, whereas Waxman-Markey says that we have to reduce our emissions to 17% below a lower baseline. And that math just doesn't add up. And I think that my constituents and the Senate ultimately will have to view whether the deal is a good one for the United States and is in our national interest.
Right.
And China going up 30% and us going down 17% with different baselines, in my opinion, flunks the good deal test by a long, long way. So I just urge you that you're going to have to figure out a way to figure out how to bridge the gap between plus 30 and minus 17.
Well, I appreciate your views, Congressman. I do think that with respect to the world broadly, with respect to the major developing countries, a very important issue is one actually which is referenced in the Leaders' Declaration from the Major Economies Forum, although not with a year specified yet, but that emissions are going to have to peak. They're not going to peak next year for China. They're just not. I mean, you can't take an economy that's growing like that and put the brakes on flat. I mean, if you look at what the trajectory is for China, it's completely different than the trajectory for the developed world. So you can't quite expect that. On the other hand, you can expect that over an appropriate period of time, the emissions growth slows, they peak, and then they start coming down. What that time is going to be an important part of the discussion.
Great. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State.
I almost think before we have a Senate debate on a treaty, everybody has to watch Slumdog Millionaire and just get a sense of what we're dealing with some of our fellow folks across the water. I want to just ask, if we had two scenarios, which one would be better for the United States? One scenario where India, let's say those people who are now living with a piece of plastic stretched over their head on a piece of bamboo and maybe one shirt to their name, and they wake up in the morning and try to figure out where they're going to get water. And when you talk to those people, that's what they say. What's the first thing you get up when you wake up? He said, I try to find some water to drink. Then maybe I try to find some food to eat. And there's 300 to 500 million of those people live that way. Now we're going to asking them, they need to act, but the question is what? So here's two scenarios. One scenario where those folks agree to a cap of the same cap that we have in the United States per person. They agree with us. They'll never emit more than we will today, and they'll agree to be bound by Waxman-Markey in a sense. But of course, their emissions would go up by a factor of 10 per person if they did that. They'd still agree to a cap, but it wouldn't do us any good. Or a situation where we demand and receive vigorous investments by them, vigorous changes in their regulatory structure, vigorous changes in their transportation infrastructure, vigorous efficiency standards in their building, some of them have done. Of those two scenarios, my view would be an agreement where we win agreements by the developing world to take action, including China, as opposed to a cap, which might be so high that they never actually ever do anything until the world's already destroyed. I'll take the action rather than the cap. What's your thoughts on that?
I completely agree, Congressman, and that's very much consistent with our focus all through this year. It's consistent with the focus in our submission. It's consistent with the focus of what we're going to be discussing in the Major Economies Forum next week here in Washington. So I couldn't agree with you more.
Well, thank you. There's two of us anyway. That's a start. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you. Well, this has been an extremely informative, helpful briefing, Mrs. Stern. We appreciate it very much. What I'd like to do is give you a couple of minutes, if you'd like, to summarize your case here to the Congress, what you think that we should do, and what your expectations are for Copenhagen in terms of the results for our country and for the planet.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to have come before you today. Look, I think that the most important thing, without a doubt, for the Congress to do is to pass legislation and send it to the President that can be that he can sign that puts that gives us the kind of credibility and leverage that would be enormously useful in the context of these negotiations. So, in terms of what can Congress do, there's obviously a lot of things Congress can do, but that's job number one as far as I'm concerned. We are going to be working hard through this fall to press our case with all of the critical parties. And that includes the Europeans, the non-EU developed countries like Japan and Australia, Canada, others, the major developing countries like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and then the kind of rank and file of, if you will, of developing countries. We need to make a case that, and I think that increasingly countries see this, that this is an absolutely critical priority for the world, that there are security, economic, and environmental consequences of not acting that are just not acceptable. I mean, the status quo is not sustainable. And we have a moment here where we can make real progress. So we have to get our own house in order as a priority, and we have to work with our developed country friends and then developing to frame out a system that people can all agree on. I think it should be built on countries committing to a set of their own national actions. I mean, that's what we've been talking about from the beginning, and that's what we think is most effective. It's got to have that. It's got to have a verification system, and there's got to be a reasonable and balanced system for supporting through financing and technology poor countries around the world. It's also important, I think, and we have been doing this, but we are going to redouble our efforts to make sure that the broad range of developing countries, not the big ones, they're in a different place. They don't actually, we're not looking for them to step up and say we're going to make midterm reductions by 2020 in the following ways. What we need them to do is develop low-carbon development strategies, low-carbon growth plans. And if they're poor countries, then with technical assistance and financing support to do that, so that everybody can get on a path to a low-carbon development and to the building of a low-carbon global economy. That's the only way. That's the only way we're going to be able to proceed. Technology development is going to be a huge part of that, but we're going to need to move forward with all of these groups, and we're going to be trying to do that at all levels. There are a number of important opportunities that the President's going to have this fall. The Secretary of State, of course, me and my team will be proceeding at full throttle, and we're going to do our best to get this done.
Well, it was a real privilege to have you come before us today. We wish you the best of luck. We will do our best from our side to work with the Senate in order to complete the legislation so that you can go fully armed into these negotiations. The next 90 days are critical, and we very much thank you for your work on behalf of our country and the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
This hearing is adjourned.